The cameras were rolling, the microphones live, and Jim Jordan leaned back in his chair with that trademark smirk, the kind that said he thought he was untouchable. In front of the packed hearing room, he puffed out his chest and, with condescending flair, launched into what he believed was a lesson in the law. His words dripped with disdain, each sentence designed not to reveal truth, but to embarrass, belittle, and dominate. "Congresswoman," he sneered, "it seems you're confused about the Constitution. Let me explain how the law really works." The words hung in the air, smug, arrogant, dripping with the assumption that Jasmine Crockett would shrink under the weight of his voice. He expected her silence. He expected the cameras to capture her fumble. He expected dominance, but then silence. Not from Crockett, but from the room itself. She sat still, her eyes locked on Jordan, her expression unreadable. For a moment, it looked as though she might let it pass. And then she spoke. Calm, precise, surgical. "Mr. Jordan," she began, her voice cutting like glass, "you might want to reconsider lecturing a practicing attorney on the law, especially when your own record suggests you struggle with the basics." The effect was instantaneous. The smirk on Jordan's face froze, his attempt at control slipping. Gasps rippled through the chamber. Reporters leaned forward. The audience at home gripped their screens tighter. It wasn't just a reply. It was the start of a takedown, because Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't match his volume. She used something far more devastating: clarity, composure, and truth. And in that moment, every person watching sensed it. The power was shifting, and what came next would not just humble Jim Jordan. It would leave him utterly speechless. To understand why this clash mattered, you have to know the stage Jim Jordan had built for himself. He wasn't just another loud voice in Congress. He had made a career out of grandstanding, out of shouting down opponents, out of pretending volume equaled truth. His hearings were never about fact-finding. They were theater, and for years that theater had worked. But on this day, the stakes were different. The hearing wasn't just routine political sparring. It was about oversight, accountability, and the very principles Jordan loved to twist for his own gain. He strutted into the room convinced he could dominate, convinced that Crockett would be just another target, another voice he could talk over until she disappeared beneath his bluster. He underestimated the moment, because for Crockett, this wasn't just another debate. It was an opportunity. An opportunity to show that arrogance could be dismantled, that ignorance masquerading as authority could be unmasked in real time, and in front of millions, no less. As Jordan rattled off half-baked legal arguments, his strategy was clear: overwhelm with noise, create confusion, and then declare victory before anyone had the chance to question the substance of his words. It was a playbook he had used for years. But against Crockett, it was doomed to fail. She wasn't just a politician. She was a trained attorney. She had fought in courtrooms, dissected arguments, cross-examined witnesses. She knew the law not as a talking point, but as a lived practice. And more importantly, she knew the tricks of men like Jordan: the feigned authority, the empty rhetoric, the reliance on tone over truth. That was what made this moment electric. It wasn't just a personal clash. It was a showdown between pretense and substance, between noise and clarity, between a man who weaponized ignorance and a woman who wielded knowledge like a scalpel. And as the hearing rolled on, people began to sense it. The energy in the room shifted. Staffers exchanged glances. Reporters' pens moved faster across their notepads. Viewers at home leaned in closer, drawn by the possibility that this time, Jordan's bluster wouldn't carry him through, because Crockett wasn't there to survive his attacks. She was there to expose them, to show that when arrogance collides with composure, arrogance always cracks. And what happened next? When Jordan pressed harder, louder, angrier, would set the stage for one of the most devastating clapbacks Congress had ever seen. Jim Jordan didn't stumble into this moment by accident. For years, he had cultivated an image: the relentless bulldog, the fiery interrogator, the man who never backed down. His allies praised him as fearless. His critics knew him as reckless. But either way, his strategy was always the same: overwhelm with volume, confuse with repetition, and wear down opponents until they simply gave up. It was a style that earned him headlines, but not respect. Again and again, Jordan showed that he wasn't interested in truth so much as domination. He'd rail against witnesses, interrupt colleagues, and hammer home talking points that sounded convincing only if you didn't stop to examine them. To Jordan, politics wasn't about persuasion, it was about performance, and his stagecraft worked for a while. His antics made him a favorite on cable news. Clips of his finger-pointing rants circulated widely, packaged as evidence of his supposed toughness. But behind the theatrics was a glaring flaw. Jordan's grasp of the law was paper-thin. This wasn't just critics talking. Legal scholars, commentators, and even his own colleagues often rolled their eyes at his tortured interpretations of statutes and constitutional principles. He'd cite provisions out of context, twist precedents until they were unrecognizable, and insist that his bluster carried the weight of expertise. In reality, it exposed his ignorance, and yet Jordan leaned into it. Why? Because in politics, perception often matters more than accuracy. He believed that if he said it loudly enough, if he projected confidence, people wouldn't notice the cracks in his arguments. For years, that gamble paid off. But here's the truth Jordan couldn't outrun: volume can't hide ignorance forever. Eventually, someone with real knowledge, real training, and real composure would expose him. That someone was Jasmine Crockett. It was almost poetic. Jordan had built a career mocking opponents, dismissing their credentials, and talking over their expertise. Crockett represented everything he underestimated: a woman, a lawyer, a public servant whose authority wasn't manufactured, but earned through grit and perseverance. The irony ran deep. Jordan often painted himself as a defender of the Constitution, yet time and again he revealed a shaky understanding of the very document he claimed to champion. Crockett, by contrast, had lived in the trenches of law, in courtrooms, not just committee rooms. She didn't need to shout to prove she knew the terrain. She simply knew it. And that's why this moment became more than just another hearing. It was the collision of two legacies: Jordan's, built on spectacle and sound bites, and Crockett's, built on substance and truth. When Jordan leaned into his tired routine that day, raising his voice, cutting her off, mocking her understanding, he thought he was on familiar ground. He thought he was performing the same play he had always performed. What he didn't realize was that this time the script would flip, because Crockett wasn't the kind of opponent who buckled under pressure. She thrived in it. And every attempt Jordan made to belittle her only set the stage for a takedown he would never forget. By the time the confrontation reached its peak, Jordan wasn't just arguing against Crockett. He was arguing against his own legacy of arrogance. A legacy about to collapse, live, in front of millions. Long before she ever sat in a congressional hearing across from Jim Jordan, Jasmine Crockett had already fought battles far tougher than anything he could throw at her. Her story wasn't one of privilege or shortcuts. It was one of grit, sacrifice, and the kind of determination that turns adversity into fuel. Born and raised in Texas, Crockett learned early what it meant to stand firm in the face of dismissal. She grew up watching communities pushed aside, voices silenced, and hardworking people denied dignity. Those lessons didn't discourage her. They sharpened her resolve. By the time she reached law school, she understood something Jordan would never grasp. The law isn't just words on paper. It's lived reality. It's the shield people cling to when the system tries to erase them. For Crockett, the law became not just a career path, but a calling, a weapon to defend the defenseless, a tool to carve out justice where injustice had been allowed to rot. Unlike Jordan, who wielded talking points, Crockett wielded trial experience. She wasn't reading from scripts or parroting theories she didn't fully understand. She had stood in real courtrooms under real pressure, representing real clients whose lives hung in the balance. She knew what it meant to cross-examine, to dismantle flimsy arguments, to slice through arrogance with fact and precedent. That's what made her so dangerous to someone like Jordan. He thrived on bluster, she thrived on precision. He could rattle off rhetoric, she could cite law. And unlike him, she didn't need to scream to be heard. Her authority came from earned credibility, not performative aggression. Her path into politics was driven by that same spirit. She didn't run for Congress to score cable news hits or build a brand. She ran because the communities she came from needed a voice inside the rooms where decisions were made. The same communities Jordan had spent his career ignoring, belittling, or exploiting for political gain. Every step of Crockett's journey prepared her for moments exactly like this one. Facing down dismissive authority figures wasn't new to her. It was her origin story. In classrooms, in courtrooms, and eventually in legislative halls, she had been underestimated, doubted, and talked over. And every single time, she learned to turn those attempts at silencing into platforms for strength. That's why, on that day in Congress, when Jordan leaned in with his smug smirk and mocked her grasp of the law, she didn't blink. She had seen men like him before. Men who mistook arrogance for intelligence, who equated noise with knowledge, who thought their bluster was enough to intimidate. What Jordan didn't realize was that every insult he lobbed only made her case stronger. He was unknowingly writing the perfect setup for the clapback of a lifetime, because Crockett wasn't just ready for his attacks. She had been forged in them. Every courtroom cross-examination, every uphill fight, every time someone told her she wasn't qualified, had built a reservoir of resilience. And on this day, she was ready to pour all of it into a response that would leave Jordan exposed and humiliated. This wasn't just Crockett the congresswoman speaking. It was Crockett the attorney, Crockett the fighter, Crockett the woman who carried the weight of her community's struggles and transformed them into unshakable authority. And when she finally chose to strike back, it would be more than a personal victory. It would be a symbolic one. A message to everyone watching that no amount of arrogance could ever silence truth delivered with clarity and conviction. Jordan thought he had cornered her. He thought his volume, his swagger, his so-called expertise would drown her out. But what he had really done was walk straight into the very trap he'd set for her, giving Jasmine Crockett the perfect opening to reveal not only his ignorance, but her own brilliance. The stage was set. The hero had been forged by her past, and now the villain was about to meet the full force of it. Live, in front of millions. The tension in the hearing room grew thicker with every passing second. Jim Jordan leaned forward, his body language dripping with aggression, his voice climbing in pitch as though sheer volume could substitute for substance. His trademark move was on full display, the fast-talking, finger-pointing barrage meant to overwhelm rather than enlighten. "Congresswoman," he sneered, "maybe if you actually understood the Constitution, you'd realize how wrong you are." Gasps rippled quietly through the chamber. It wasn't just an insult. It was a direct attack on her credibility, a suggestion that her years of legal study and courtroom experience meant nothing. Jordan was confident. Too confident. He thought this was his moment to crush her. But Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't even lean back. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, almost amused, as if she were watching a child throw a tantrum. She knew Jordan's game. He wasn't making an argument. He was performing. For his base, for the cameras, for the illusion of dominance. Still, Jordan pressed harder. He waved papers in the air, barking about statutes he half understood, cherry-picking phrases, twisting legal terms as though repetition could turn error into fact. His voice boomed, "This is basic! Any first-year law student would know this. How could you possibly—" And there it was. The arrogance. The presumption that Crockett, a licensed attorney with years of courtroom victories, was somehow beneath even a novice law student. The chamber buzzed with murmurs. Even some of Jordan's allies shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but Jordan didn't notice. He was too busy pounding the table, his face flushed, his words tripping over one another as he tried to tighten his grip on the narrative. To him, this was the climax. He believed Crockett was cornered, trapped under the weight of his noise and bravado. What he didn't realize was that Crockett wasn't cornered. She was coiling. She was letting him dig deeper, letting him expose his own ignorance for all to see. With every overblown claim, every butchered interpretation of the law, he wasn't building a case against her. He was building the perfect setup for her takedown. The audience leaned in. They could feel the energy shift. Crockett's calm composure wasn't weakness. It was patience. And patience in a fighter like her was lethal. Jordan thought he was tightening the noose. What he didn't know was that he was tying it around his own neck. Finally, as Jordan slammed down his final point, smirking as if he'd scored a knockout, Crockett adjusted her microphone. The room hushed instantly. Her poise alone commanded attention. "Are you finished, Congressman?" she asked softly. No anger, no raised voice. Just controlled authority that cut sharper than any shout. Jordan froze. He hadn't expected composure. He had expected her to stumble, to meet fire with fire, to crack under the barrage. But instead, Crockett was cool, steady, deliberate. The silence that followed was electric. Everyone in that chamber knew something seismic was about to happen. Crockett was no longer reacting. She was about to strike. And when she did, it wouldn't just dismantle Jordan's argument. It would expose, in real time, the very legal ignorance he had so arrogantly flaunted. The escalation was over. The moment of reckoning had arrived. Crockett leaned forward, her hands steady, her eyes locked on Jordan with the kind of calm intensity that could silence even the rowdiest crowd. The room, moments ago buzzing with Jordan's theatrics, now sat in near silence. It wasn't the silence of boredom. It was anticipation. Everyone knew something was about to happen. Something decisive. "Congressman," she began, her voice smooth but firm. "You keep bringing up the Constitution as though shouting it louder makes you right. But let me remind you, law isn't about volume. It's about understanding." A ripple of reaction swept through the chamber. Crockett's words cut straight to the heart of Jordan's performance. Noise without knowledge. Jordan shifted in his chair, his smirk faltering. He tried to interject, but Crockett didn't give him the oxygen. Her tone sharpened, each word landing like a hammer on steel. "You claim any first-year law student would know this? Congressman, I teach law to my interns. I practiced it in the courtroom. I lived it in real fights where real people's rights were on the line. And what you're doing right now? Misquoting statutes, cherry-picking phrases out of context, pretending volume equals truth? That's not law. That's theater." The room broke into murmurs. Journalists scribbled furiously. Even the cameras seemed to zoom in tighter, hungry to capture every flicker of this exchange. Jordan's face flushed deeper. He raised his voice again, but it cracked under pressure. No, you're wrong. Everyone knows." But Crockett leaned in closer, her delivery surgical now. "Everyone knows what, Congressman? That you can spin a phrase? That you can shout down witnesses? Because when it comes to actual legal reasoning, you're exposed. And here's why." She picked up the very papers Jordan had been waving dramatically just minutes earlier. With composure, she read the section he had quoted, then calmly pointed to the sentence immediately following it. "You conveniently left this part out," she said, her finger underlining the text. "The part that proves you've been misleading everyone listening. If a first-year law student tried that trick in class, they'd fail. And if an attorney tried it in court, they'd be sanctioned." Gasps erupted. Crockett had not only corrected him, she had humiliated him with his own evidence. Jordan's attempt to weaponize the law had backfired spectacularly. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. Then she delivered the blow that left no room for recovery. "You see, Congressman Jordan, legal ignorance isn't just embarrassing in this chamber, it's dangerous. Because when leaders like you misrepresent the law to score political points, the American people suffer. The truth gets buried under your noise, and I refuse to let that happen today." For the first time all day, Jordan had nothing. No quip, no retort, no volume to lean on. He sat back, his face a storm of frustration and disbelief, while Crockett pressed on with unwavering strength. Let me make it clear for everyone watching at home, she said, turning slightly toward the cameras. The Constitution isn't a prop. The law isn't a toy. And our democracy deserves leaders who can do more than shout slogans. It deserves leaders who understand what they're talking about. The chamber erupted into applause. Rare, spontaneous, almost uncontrollable. Even some who had been skeptical of Crockett earlier couldn't help but acknowledge the precision of her takedown. Social media lit up instantly, hashtags forming before the words were even finished. Clips of her dismantling Jordan began circulating in real time, and yet Crockett wasn't finished. She delivered one final line, her voice calm but unshakable, the kind of line destined to be replayed on cable news for weeks. So the next time you want to lecture me on what a first-year law student should know, Congressman, I suggest you do a little studying yourself. Because right now, you're proving that you wouldn't pass the class. The room exploded. Applause, laughter, gasps. It was a symphony of validation. Jordan's face turned stone. His smirk had vanished completely, replaced by the unmistakable look of a man who had been thoroughly, publicly dismantled. Crockett sat back, composed, as though she hadn't just delivered one of the most brutal clapbacks in congressional memory. For her, this wasn't about ego. It wasn't about spectacle. It was about truth. And the truth had spoken louder than Jordan ever could. The clash was over. And Jasmine Crockett had not only survived Jordan's storm, she had turned it into the stage for his downfall. But what happened after the hearing ended would take this fiery exchange to an entirely new level, one that neither Jordan nor his allies were prepared for. The gavel fell, signaling the end of the hearing, but the story was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. Jasmine Crockett's fiery dismantling of Jim Jordan didn't stay confined within the four walls of that chamber. It detonated outward like a political earthquake, reverberating across the country in real time. Before Crockett even left her seat, Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram lit up with clips of her calm, calculated takedown. One viral post read, "Jim Jordan tried to school a lawyer and she sent him back to class. Jasmine Crockett, legend." Within minutes, the hashtag #NotCrockettClapback was trending nationally. Cable news producers scrambled to splice together highlights. Networks broke into programming with urgent chirons. Crockett silences Jordan in live showdown. On YouTube, political commentary channels rushed to upload their reactions. Thumbnails plastered with Jordan's red-faced grimace contrasted against Crockett's cool, composed stare. The visual alone told the story, and the public ate it up. Ordinary Americans who were tired of watching chaos and arrogance in Congress found validation in Crockett's strength. Comments flooded in. Finally, someone stood up to Jordan. This is why representation matters. She didn't just defend herself. She defended all of us who've been dismissed, ignored, or shouted down. Jordan's allies tried damage control. Within hours, conservative pundits appeared on friendly talk shows downplaying the exchange, insisting Jordan had made solid points. But their words rang hollow. The clip didn't lie. People had seen him stumble, sputter, and ultimately get schooled. And no spin could erase the raw footage of Crockett holding her ground with devastating precision. Even late-night comedians joined in. Monologues were peppered with punchlines. Jim Jordan tried to teach law to a lawyer and got graded F for fail. Audiences roared. The takedown had leapt from politics into pop culture. But the impact wasn't just laughter, it was inspiration. Across college campuses, young law students and activists replayed Crockett's moment like a motivational highlight reel. Professors used it as a teaching tool, showing how composure and clarity could outmatch bluster and intimidation. For many young viewers, especially women of color, it wasn't just a viral clip, it was a mirror reflecting what strength looked like in the halls of power. Meanwhile, Crockett's supporters in her home district flooded her office with calls and emails of encouragement. Constituents thanked her for standing tall, for refusing to let arrogance silence knowledge. One woman wrote, "Watching you reminded me of my grandmother, who who always said, "Dignity defeats noise." Thank you for proving her right. And perhaps the most telling sign of all came from inside Congress itself. Lawmakers who rarely crossed party lines quietly approached Crockett in the hallways, some with smiles, others with knowing nods. They didn't have to say much. Their looks said it all. She had done what few could, faced down Jim Jordan's fury and left him speechless. Of course, Jordan didn't take it well. Reporters hounded him with questions as he left the chamber. "Congressman, do you have a response to Representative Crockett's remarks?" He brushed them off, his lips pressed into a thin line. For a man who thrived on the spotlight, his silence spoke volumes. And yet, the more Jordan tried to move on, the bigger the moment grew. Editorials poured in from major outlets. Headlines read, "Crockett exposes Jordan's weakness," and "A new voice emerges in Congress." Political analysts framed it as a turning point, not just a clash between two personalities, but a clash between two ways of doing politics. Arrogance versus expertise, noise versus knowledge, spectacle versus substance. By the end of the week, Crockett's name was on every trending list. Her fundraising numbers had spiked, and her clip had been viewed tens of millions of times across platforms. This wasn't just a viral moment. It was a career-defining one, and yet, through all the chaos and celebration, Crockett remained grounded. When asked about it in an interview, she smiled and said simply, "I didn't go in there to make a viral moment. I went in there to speak truth to power. If that inspires people, then I've done my job." But inspiration was only the beginning. The true power of her words would reveal itself in how people carried them forward. In classrooms, in living rooms, in voting booths. Crockett's clash with Jordan wasn't just an exchange, it was a spark. And the fire it ignited was only growing. Still, as powerful as the immediate aftermath was, the real question lingered. What lesson would the country take from this moment? Would it fade like just another viral clip, or would it endure as a moral turning point? The answer would come in the resolution that followed, where Crockett transformed her victory into a message far bigger than herself. In the days after the exchange, Jasmine Crockett's words lingered far beyond the echo of the gavel. What the public saw wasn't just a clash between two lawmakers. It was a parable about power, arrogance, and truth. When reporters asked Crockett if she felt proud about silencing Jim Jordan, she didn't gloat. She didn't boast. Instead, she reframed the entire confrontation. "This was never about me versus him," she said. "This was about the people's right to honesty, clarity, and dignity in our government. When leaders choose noise over knowledge, everyone loses. My job is to make sure people don't lose." Her answer resonated because it flipped the narrative. To her, Jordan wasn't the real opponent. Ignorance was. Arrogance was. The corrosive idea that shouting and bullying could pass for leadership was... And in that moment, she showed millions of Americans that dignity, patience, and facts weren't weaknesses to be drowned out. They were strengths capable of piercing through the loudest storm. The beauty of her clapback wasn't just in the sharpness of her words, but in the values they carried. Crockett's calm dismantling of Jordan's bluster reminded people that America's greatest strength isn't found in insults or intimidation, but in reason and justice. Community leaders picked up on this. Faith groups and advocacy organizations cited her exchange in sermons and speeches. One minister in Atlanta told his congregation, "What Jasmine Crockett showed us is that you don't have to match arrogance with arrogance. You can meet it with truth, and truth will always stand taller." For many immigrants and marginalized communities, Crockett's poise was deeply personal. They saw in her a reflection of their own battles. Being underestimated, being talked over, being told they didn't belong. And yet, with her steady voice and unflinching resolve, she turned dismissal into validation. She gave voice to those who had long been silenced. The lesson wasn't just political, it was human. Crockett reminded the country that intelligence doesn't need to shout, that calm doesn't mean weak, and that standing tall isn't about volume, it's about conviction. And perhaps most importantly, she reminded America of its own story. From the earliest days, the nation had been shaped not by those who screamed the loudest, but by those who believed most deeply in the principles of justice, equality, and truth. Crockett tapped into that lineage, connecting her moment in the chamber to something timeless. The Constitution, she said in a later interview, isn't about who can talk the longest or yell the loudest. It's about protecting people. All people. And that's the work I'll keep showing up for, no matter who tries to shout me down. Those words landed with particular weight because they weren't just rhetoric. They were lived experience. Crockett had faced down arrogance and ignorance in real time and emerged not only unshaken, but stronger. And so, what began as another heated congressional clash ended with something rare, a moment of clarity. A reminder that in a time of noise, truth still matters, that dignity still resonates, that when arrogance meets resolve, arrogance loses. But the story wasn't finished. Because while Crockett's moral victory had been clear, the larger battle, the one for America's future direction, was still unfolding. And if this moment was any indication, Jasmine Crockett was prepared to keep fighting it, one clapback at a time. And so, when the dust settled, the lesson of that fiery hearing was crystal clear. Arrogance will always collapse under the weight of truth. Jim Jordan may have walked into that chamber convinced that volume could drown out knowledge, but Jasmine Crockett reminded him, and all of us, that substance will always outlast noise. Her calm, steady clapback wasn't just about winning a debate. It was about restoring dignity to a space that too often rewards chaos. It was about showing the American people that leadership doesn't come from shouting down your opponent, but from lifting up the truth. For millions watching at home, her words carried more than just political weight. They carried validation. They carried hope. They carried the reminder that in the face of arrogance, composure is power. And in the face of ignorance, clarity is courage. This wasn't just a congressional clash. It was a mirror held up to the country, a reminder of who we are and who we deserve to be. Jasmine Crockett didn't just shut down Jim Jordan. She lit a spark of inspiration that belongs to everyone who's ever been silenced, dismissed, or underestimated. But here's the thing. Sparks only matter if we keep them alive. If you felt pride watching Crockett's moment, if you believe truth should always outshine noise, then this is your time to stand with her. Share this story. Keep this energy alive, and make sure voices like hers are never drowned out by bluster and intimidation, because the fight for dignity isn't hers alone. It's ours.